I love you. I'm going to get a parrot. That's all I need. Just a parrot. Just says, I love you. I love you. I love you. Fascists, vandals, Nazis, Stalinists. No, not Stalinists, fascists. That's how an angry president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, described the thousands of Bolsonaro supporters who stormed his nation's capital on Sunday, taking over the presidential palace and buildings that house Brazil's Supreme Court and Congress. I'm David Feldman, and this is the Mop-Up. Insurrectionists tore into Brazil's Supreme Court, ransacking the building, destroying priceless art, with one protester videotaping himself defecating inside one of the justices' offices. When did that become a thing? Others broke into the presidential palace, destroying furniture, smashing windows, and tossing computers out the window. The buildings, luckily, were empty since the president was out of town and the legislature was in recess. So no elected government officials were in danger, but 8 journalists covering the riot were injured by the crowd. President Lula invoked his constitutional authority that grants him, in a time of crisis, temporary power to restore law and order. Until the end of this month, all federal police will answer solely to Lula, with one minister warning these extraordinary powers could be extended well into February. Flávio Dino, Brazil's new Prime Minister of Justice, said he will personally be investigating what role local police played in cooperating with the insurrectionists. The local police. President Lula defeated former President Bolsonaro at the end of last October, and yesterday Lula accused Bolsonaro of politicizing local police forces, convincing them to put Bolsonaro before democracy. There are reportedly videos of local police officers cooperating with the protesters, talking with them, using their cameras to film the attack instead of stopping it, while occasionally posing for selfies with the rioters. There are reports that during the heat of the riot, requests for more police were ignored by the local governor, who is said to be a supporter of Bolsonaro. Supporters of Bolsonaro had been camping outside military buildings for weeks, convinced the election had been rigged. They reportedly begged the army to overthrow Lula and restore Bolsonaro, who has relocated to Orlando, Florida, about 2 weeks ago. He has refused to concede or even attend Lula's inauguration on January 1st. As the rioting continued for 3 hours, Bolsonaro issued a statement condemning the violence, saying, quote, "It crossed the line." Bolsonaro's wife said on Monday her husband is now in a Florida hospital suffering from some sort of abdominal distress. Democratic Congressman Joaquin Castro told CNN that Bolsonaro is guilty of inciting violence and should be sent back to Brazil to answer for it immediately. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Monday called on President Biden to send Bolsonaro back to Brazil so he could face impending charges for inciting the violence. And President Lula today blamed Bolsonaro for the violence and promised to hold everyone responsible accountable. Meanwhile, a leading Brazilian senator has filed a motion with Brazil's Supreme Court demanding Bolsonaro be extradited to his country in the next 72 hours to face charges for his role in Sunday's violence. America's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, says so far no Brazilian courts have contacted the United States requesting Bolsonaro to be sent back. Sullivan told reporters that the National Security Department will deal with that issue when it arises. The Financial Times reports that it is well within Joe Biden's power to deport any foreign leader he deems a threat to America's security or foreign policy. The Financial Times also reports Bolsonaro is probably in America on a 30-day visa that would have to be renewed in 2 weeks. Business Insider reports that this morning, Steve Bannon called the people who stormed the Capitol Brazilian freedom fighters. Working as a consultant to Bolsonaro, Bannon has been claiming voter fraud in Brazil since before Bolsonaro even lost the election. Former President Donald Trump endorsed Bolsonaro and, not surprisingly, has remained silent since Sunday's riot. The Washington Post reported back in November that Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, who serves in the Brazilian Congress, he flew to Mar-a-Lago after his father was defeated in October to meet with Donald Trump for advice on what to do next. On that trip, he reportedly also talked with Steve Bannon by phone. Bannon couldn't be there in person because at the time of the visit, Bannon was in Arizona assisting election denier Kari Lake with her false claims that she lost her race for Arizona governor due to voter fraud. 2 weeks ago, the Arizona Supreme Court rejected Kari Lake's claims of voter fraud, but that doesn't stop Kari Lake from jetting back and forth to Mar-a-Lago while claiming she is now, quote, the duly elected governor of Arizona. These people are incredible. Bolsonaro's son on that trip also met with former Trump spokesman Jason Miller. Jason Miller left the Trump White House to join Newsmax. He runs Getter, that's a social media platform, and he briefly worked over at CNN right after leaving the Trump White House. Jason is a good family guy. He's married, has 2 small children. Well, technically he has 3 small children, and the 3rd child he had was born only months after his 2nd child was born. No, his wife isn't one of those swamp wallabies that can get pregnant while they're already pregnant. At least I don't think Jason Miller's wife is a swamp wallaby. Somebody should probably look into it. But I'm pretty sure Jason Miller's wife isn't a swamp wallaby. From what I've read, the reason Jason Miller had his 3rd child only months after his 2nd child was born is because he is a rat. Yes, he's a rat. You see, Jason Miller, while promoting conservative Christian values and trying to secure the presidency for Donald Trump, you all remember Donald Trump, the darling of America's evangelical community, which thinks sex is dirty. Well, while trying to get family man Donald Trump elected president, Jason Miller had an extramarital, adulterous sexual intercourse, penis and vagina affair with another Trump staffer by the name of A.J. Delgado. A.J. Delgado. The good news is, like all good Christian conservatives, the 2 of them didn't use contraception. The bad news is they're not just against contraception, they're also opposed to abortion. So A.J. Delgado kept the baby. But like all good Christian conservatives, Jason Miller owned up to his mistake, said the baby was his, and worked it out with his wife so that he would pay child support and share custody and participate in his illegitimate child's life. Just kidding. Jason Miller, conservative, family values, all about family values. He did the Republican thing and refused to pay child support. Anyway, don't take my word. Here is CNN's Jake Tapper's tweet on January 3rd, 2021, which is addressed directly to Jason Miller. While I have your attention, pay your child support. Seems to me, Jason Miller, if you're an anti-abortion Republican who has a child out of wedlock and then must be taken to court kicking and screaming to pay child support, your career as a Republican should be aborted. But what do I know? There's simply no accountability with these people. People? Yeah, I'll be generous, people. They just move on. Jason Miller was advising the Bolsonaro family, so you can clearly see that the Bolsonaro family was seeking advice from America's best and brightest, and by best and brightest, I mean worst and dimmest. As I said, the son, Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro, worked closely with the Trump administration and was in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, when Trump supporters seized our nation's capital. Presumably, Eduardo was there to take notes. The Post, the Washington Post, reported back in November that after Lula won, Steve Bannon advised a distraught Bolsonaro family to contest the election results, which Bolsonaro immediately did, insisting 250,000 voting machines didn't work properly. But unlike in America, Brazil doesn't put up with election denying. Last year, Brazil's Supreme Court ordered several Bolsonaro supporters, including Brazilian Congresswoman Carla Zambelli, who herself had 10 million Twitter followers. She and several other Bolsonaro supporters were ordered by their Supreme Court to get off social media permanently after they refused to stop spreading lies about voter fraud. Interesting. She also reportedly chased after a Lula supporter during the election while brandishing a gun. Good people. Did I mention that when Bolsonaro won 4 years ago, he was a big supporter of gun rights, and the National Rifle Association made a lot of money helping him? The Post reports that Congresswoman Zambelli has flown to Washington, D.C. several times to meet with Trump advisors about election fraud, or at least how to spread the lies about election fraud. Now, while Joe Biden has condemned Sunday's violence in Brazil, Republicans have been silent, absolutely silent, except for two Republicans. Florida Senator and Medicare scam artist Rick Scott. Remember, he ripped off Medicare for more than $1 billion, and so he became a Republican senator. So Florida Senator Rick Scott condemned the violence. These are the only two Republicans so far who have condemned the violence in Brazil. Florida Senator Rick Scott, and get ready for this, newly sworn in Republican congressman from New York and Olympic figure skating gold medalist, as well as lead guitarist for Limp Bizkit, none other than Archbishop George Santos. George Santos was born in Brazil, and he condemned the violence. Wait, I'm being told this is not a picture of George Santos? That's not what George Santos looks like? Wait, I've been sexting with him for weeks. That's not George Santos. Do we have a picture of what the real George Santos looks like? The one in the middle? Ah, damn, he's even sexier than the pictures he texted me. Call me George. Well, as of today, President Trump has issued no comment about the insurrection, the January 8th insurrection, and the newly elected Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has also failed to condemn the violence in Brazil. But why would Kevin McCarthy condemn the violence in Brazil? He hardly condemned the violence on January 6. You do remember he refused to certify the election for Joe Biden only hours after Trump supporters stormed the Capitol and tried to hang the lady who used to have Kevin McCarthy's new job. So if he's not going to condemn that violence, Why would we expect Kevin McCarthy to condemn the July 8th violence in Brazil? When I was a kid, it's a nice picture of me. When I was a kid, Americans looked at the turmoil in South America and asked, could it happen here? After January 6th, the people of Brazil asked, could it happen here? And on January 8th, it did. I'm naive, but it's unimaginable to me that there are actually people, Americans, who are opposed to democracy. But there are, and there always have been. In fact, they came up with this country. The people who gave us this republic, they kind of sort of believed in majority rule, but not really. Our founding criminals, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, they gave us the Senate and the Electoral College to prevent the mob from seizing power. And while I have nothing but contempt for our founding criminals, and you want to tear down their statues, and you probably should, I don't care. But there is still a promise they made to America, and that is to make it more democratic. That is the promise these criminals made to future generations. You know, elites have always found it fashionable to say they possess a Madisonian mistrust of the mob. And James Madison essentially wrote the U.S. Constitution. He was a slaveholder, an evil slaveholder. Well, they're all evil. And he baked into our Constitution speed bumps to prevent most Americans from voting. So James Madison, slaveholder, wrote the Constitution. He is one of our nation's founding criminals. I feel no need to celebrate, no need to thank him. But since we're still working off his blueprint for government, it is worth noting that this monster's Autobahn, if you will, is the American people's ability to amend the Constitution. He gave us an Autobahn. You know, Hitler gave us the Autobahn. Madison gave us an Autobahn, which allowed us to amend the Constitution. Unlike the majority of idiots who sit on our Supreme Court, James Madison, the slaveholder who wrote the Constitution, did not for 1 second believe the Constitution was anything other than a living and breathing document that had to be amended every now and then to change with the times. So if you're looking for original intent, if you're a strict textualist, then you must read the Constitution in the context of now, not when it was written, but today. The original intent of our founding criminals was more democracy, with the caveat, when we're ready for it. Again, I'm not going to defend the criminals who wrote the Constitution. I think it's dangerous to worship anyone. And so did our founding fathers, by the way. They didn't believe in autocrats. They didn't believe in worshiping God, for all we know. They believed that anyone who had too much power should be automatically cut off at the knees. And I like that. They also believed in something resembling majority rule. Something resembling majority rule. Not majority rule, something resembling it, with the promise to keep making America more of a democracy. But what we are dealing with here now is an open rebellion, specifically in the Republican Party. It is an open rebellion of fascists, authoritarians who don't believe in democracy because they don't believe in voting. That's why they keep calling these elections rigged. They want to discredit the democratic process. They want Americans to believe that their votes can't be counted because they don't. People like Steve Bannon don't believe in people voting. These people, it's hard to believe that these people exist here in America. We are so naive. The venality that exists that if we don't pay attention to it, they will run us all over. These people exist. These are the same people camping outside the Brazilian Defense Ministry, begging the Brazilian military to overthrow Lula and take their country back to when it was ruled by generals. Make Brazil great again. You see, Brazil was a military dictatorship from 1964 until 1985. And there are many, many people, including the Bolsonaro family, Steve Bannon, and Donald Trump, who think that was Brazil's golden age. These people do not believe in democracy. I know it's hard to believe, but too many Americans do not believe in majority rule. And yet, they insist that they are real Americans. They insist that they are the real patriots. They are not. America is about more democracy, not less democracy, more and more and more. The great constitutional scholar, Congressman Jamie Raskin, writes in the January 6 report that most of the 17 amendments added to the Constitution since the Bill of Rights, most of those 17 amendments were intended to make America more of a democracy, to give more, not less, voice to the so-called mob. Congressman Raskin writes that starting with the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, America has tried to transform itself from a slave republic to a democratic one. That gives me hope. That gives me the chills, that we are working to transform this country from a slave republic to a democratic republic, and we are not there yet. We still have slavery in this country. Many of our prisons still force inmates to work either for free or pennies on the dollar. Our prison system has more black men either behind bars or out on parole than there were black slaves in 1850. But this country is still bending towards, not away from, more and more democracy. As Professor Corey Brettschneider suggested on this program countless times, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees due process and equal protection under the law, is almost like the United States Constitution Part 2. It's kind of like our New Testament. It's making up for our sins of the past, the 14th Amendment. It could be said that the 14th Amendment is a constitution all by itself. Despite all the undemocratic atrocities America continues to commit here and overseas, our sacred documents, especially the 14th Amendment, have always promised more democracy, not less of it. But as we see on January 6th and now on January 8th in Brazil, there are those who hate democracy. They insist too much freedom is dangerous, and ordinary Americans cannot be trusted to decide their own fate. These are authoritarians who chose violence over democracy. They claim their country must be protected from the mob without realizing they themselves are the mob. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is the disqualification clause. I'm going to read it to you, the disqualification clause of the 14th Amendment. It clearly states, quote, "No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. What that means is if you aided and abetted or participated in an insurrection, that automatically disqualifies you from ever holding elective office again. That is why our brand new Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, should not be working with Congressman Paul Gosar, who begged Donald Trump for a pardon after January 6. He should not be working with Congressman Andy Biggs, who begged President Trump for a pardon after January 6. He should not be working with Congressman Scott Perry, whose phone was seized by the FBI last summer. These men and a lot of other Republicans are disqualified to hold elective office for the role they played in the January 6th insurrection. Let me go one step further. Any member of Congress who returned to the Capitol hours after January 6th and voted not to certify the presidential election for Joe Biden was doing Donald Trump's dirty work. They were continuing to stop the peaceful transfer of power by perpetuating a fraud, that's the second time I screwed that word, perpetrating a fraud on the American people. They were continuing the insurrection. They were continuing the insurrection after the Capitol had been cleared out. By not voting to certify the election for Joe Biden at about 3 a.m. on January 7th, 2021, they were continuing the insurrection. The purpose of that whole plan was to stop a peaceful transfer of power. They were participating in an insurrection by voting against certifying the election for Joe Biden. They were participating in the very same insurrection that Donald Trump and his gang orchestrated, and therefore, under the 14th Amendment, they are automatically disqualified from ever holding elective office again. Kevin McCarthy, our new Speaker, refused to certify the election for Joe Biden after that insurrection. And by failing to vote to certify, he continued the insurrection. And then he went to Mar-a-Lago afterwards to kiss Donald Trump's ring. And he still denies Joe Biden won in 2020. January 6 continues. January 6 continues. Trump is still calling members of Congress. He was calling the floor to get McCarthy elected Friday night. He is still running for president. Kevin McCarthy doesn't deserve to be Speaker because under the 14th Amendment, he doesn't deserve to be a member of Congress. He should be disqualified because he is an election denier who refused to certify the election for Joe Biden. McCarthy has even promised to defang the House Ethics Office to make sure nobody involved in the insurrection of January 6, including himself, will ever be held accountable. Lula of Brazil is promising to hold Bolsonaro accountable for January 8th. Meanwhile, Donald Trump walks free and has not been disqualified from running for office. And so January 6th rages on to this day. I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak.